on my father's side. Now on my mother's side was Thomas, Robert Porter Thomas from Arkansas. And you want to get in touch with the ancestors that came from the States. It's a pity my other cousin, he telephoned me. Leola is her name. Another country. She lives out in the country. But she's not at home now. She's in São Paulo. She'll only be back in next Monday. She's 93 years old already. It would be very good for you to get in contact with her also.
I'll be here for 2 weeks.
For 2 weeks?
Yes.
Very well. Very good. And where do you stay, in a hotel?
I'm staying
with
their family.
And how did you happen to know him?
I used my computer on the internet and went to the web page for the Confederados here, and he was listed as one of the contacts for the group, so I sent an email to him.
Very well. He's my cousin.
So on your father?
On my, no, he's from the Thomas side, my mother's side.
Your ancestors decided to come here. Did they fight in the Civil War?
Yes, they were Confederates. In the Civil War, my great-grandfather Alfred Ivan Smith was a bugler in the war. And my great-grandfather on the other side was a sergeant. And General Lee's, he was a commander-in-chief of the Confederates. And they fought in the war also.
And then
soon when they lost, because the Southerners lost, as you know, and they got disgusted with the reason was my father always said they were considered rebels, and didn't want to submit themselves to the northern laws. So they picked up and came to Brazil. On both sides. And they didn't know one another. My great-grandfather didn't know Alfred Iverson Smith and vice versa. They knew themselves here in Brazil. And my parents, my grandfather and grandmother married here in Brazil. They knew each other here in Brazil and married. And my father and mother were the first generation. I'm of the second generation. That's what I can explain to you.
And then they came straight to which colony did they live in? Which of the colonies did they live in Sorocaba here, or did they go?
No, they came. Some came to the litter of Brazil on the Smith side. The Thomas came to São Paulo. And they met here, got to know each other here in Campinas. That's more or less the story.
And what type of jobs did they have here? Were they
farmers? Both were farmers. They bought land in Campinas, in that region, and they were farmers. But on my mother's side, Robert Porter Thomas, he was a farmer and a preacher also. he was a Baptist preacher. And on my father's side, Alfred Iverson Smith was Methodist. They were all evangelics.
And then your parents, what kind of jobs did they have?
My father was a farmer also. And my mother, my grandfather, her father was a farmer also. They were all farmers.
Cotton farmers or sugar?
Pardon?
Cotton farmers, or what type of crop do they farm?
Principally, the beginning that they farmed here in Campinas, in this region, was melons. They brought this melon seed from the States and began farming with melons. And the Smith side, he worked a lot with planting coffee. In Brazil, you know, coffee is one of the principal things of Brazil, is coffee. They were all farmers. Most of the Americans that came were from the South. They were Southerners, farmers. My great-grandfather Smith, Alfred Iverson Smith, he himself declared he never owned a slave. He said, I went to war because it was the wish of the majority of the Southerners. But he himself, he had nothing to do with slavery. He never had a slave.
But some of the other members of
The Thomas side had
slaves. And when they arrived in Brazil, did any of them get slaves here in Brazil to work on the farms?
Yes, because Brazil had slavery, but they already knew that slavery in Brazil was coming to an end also, because they came. Both families came in 1866 and 65 and 66. In 1888, the slavery was abolished in Brazil also. But they had slaves here in Brazil also.
And were they upset by the abolition of slavery here? Or did they already know that it was going to take place?
Beg pardon?
Were they disappointed that slavery was
No, for
abolished?
them it was indifferent. Because they worked themselves in the fields.
Right alongside with the slaves.
Side by side with the slaves.
And then afterwards they hired people to work the farms.
They hired Brazilians and taught them how to work with on the farm, agriculture. They planted all kinds of things. They most planted melons, but then they planted coffee, rice, beans, all kinds of what you raise on the farm.
Did your ancestors have any difficulty adjusting to life in Brazil? How did they enter into Brazilian society?
I didn't understand.
Did they have difficulties adjusting
Yes,
to
of
Brazil?
course, they had difficulty. No, not so many, but they had difficulty until they learned to speak Portuguese. That's why I know them.
And the Brazilian people were very welcoming to them. The Brazilian people were very hospitable.
They welcomed them and treated them well. In that line, they was welcoming them. The only thing that they I don't know if you know, but the first American lady that died here in Santa Barbara in Campinas, this region. They took the lady to bury her in Santa Barbara. The story I know is that. And the Catholics didn't permit for a Protestant to be buried in the Catholic cemetery. And that in those days, where the cemetery is today, belonged to just a minute. I forget his name, Cornell. Back and bury her on my farm. And they buried her there and made a little fence around for cattle not to. And there was the beginning of the cemetery that's there today, up today. You never went to the cemetery.
No, we're gonna go.
It would be very interesting for you to go and see what is the American cemetery in Santa Barbara West. So then each one that died, buried there. There, and it's called today Cementerio do Campo, Campo Cemetery, American Cemetery. My mother, the rest of my mother, I took her bones up from São Paulo and buried her there also.
So the first generation of your family to be born in Brazil was your parents' generation?
Pardon?
Your parents' generation was the first generation to be born in Brazil?
My father and mother, my parents were born already in Brazil. They were the first generation born in Brazil. What came from the States was my great-grandparents. Ourselves, Iverson Smith and Robert Porter Thomas.
And then your grandparents were born in Brazil.
In Brazil. They married in Brazil and was born in Brazil.
And did which generation naturalized to become citizens of Brazil? Did your great-grandparents become citizens of Brazil?
Some did. Others, they stayed American citizens. But some of them became Brazilian citizens. My father, the government in those years, at that time, he was invited to, if he wanted to be naturalized American, he said, no, I want to be Brazilian. And some wanted to be American. I worked in Light and Power in São Paulo, and the superintendent his name was William Terrell. And he naturalized himself. He was born in Brazil, but he naturalized himself as American. Some born that way.
Do you consider yourself part American or just
Well,
Brazil?
the fact remains that a person like me, like myself, let's say half and half. I consider I'm half American and half Brazilian. But I'm really a Brazilian. I was born and bred in Brazil. So I'm a Brazilian.
Have you ever been to the United States?
No, I've never had a chance to go to the States.
Would you like to see the
Well,
South?
Principally, if I could go back to, if I could go to South Carolina and see where my great-grandparents lived.
Which part of South Carolina did they live
I only know that it was South Carolina I don't know what county. I don't know. I only know he lived in South Carolina. And the other side he had a farm in Arkansas, a ranch, let's call it, I believe Americans call it a ranch. And he left. One of the reasons, principal reasons he left, because he came in 1871, 5 or 6 years after the war. He was a sergeant in General Lee's Confederates. And he came to Brazil 5 or 6 years after the war. And the reason, I told my cousin, I believe the principal reason was that he had bought in Arkansas. He had bought a farm. It's here in the book. There's many acres. He paid, nearly to sin, $12,000. He paid $12,000. In 5 years, 6 years after the war, the North put up the census, the census, and they valued his farm in $4,000. I believe that was the reason he came to Brazil. But he said, instead of me progressing, I'm going back.
Did any members of your family go back to the United States after?
Yes. Some, not all, but some. I have an uncle, Uncle Virgil. He was my grandfather's brother. The story, my father always told the story. There were 7 brothers and 1 sister. And of the 7 brothers, 1 wanted to go back. And the story is that he began his road to go back to the States. He was relatively a poor man. He left here in Campinas, left horseback to go to the States. It's a long story. I have a letter here of one of my cousins. It was his daughter. And esse troço aí é filmador, ele don't speak English. I tried to teach them, but they didn't want it.
But you learned from your parents? Your parents both spoke English?
My parents spoke. I learned English with them.
No. And no one in your family intermarried before you? Your parents or your grandparents are all American descendants?
All Americans.
And your wife is
She's
Brazilian?
And the second generation, began marrying with Brazilians. The first generation only married Americans. That's the story I know. And the second generation, as he said, the Americans say they opened up, and many began marrying Brazilians, like myself.
And did your grandparents and parents maintain contact with relatives in the United States throughout all this time?
Yes, I remember my father and my mother. They received monthly magazines from the States.
And did they write to any of the relatives that were left behind in the United States?
Yes, they had. They kept up correspondence with who stayed in the States. my aunt Mary, my grandfather's sister, Aunt Mary. Robert Porter Thomas came to Brazil, but this aunt of mine, she was already married, and she stayed in the States, and they would correspond all the time.
And did your family stay aware of the political situation in the United States and all of the changes?
I didn't understand.
Did your family learn about what was happening back in the United States
Yes,
after
they always kept up with what was happening.
What did they think about the changes after Reconstruction when the South regained control from the North?
In this book that my cousin of mine wrote, my great-grandfather, he, after some time in Brazil, he wanted to go back because he left his farm in Arkansas, but never went back.
And do you continue to pass stories in your family about the South before the Civil War? Are there any stories that you passed through your family?
Before the Civil War?
Or during the Civil War?
No. And what's written books that I was seeing, that my ancestors, some came from Holland, others came from England, and I say in sixth place back, one of my I'd say grandfathers, he was a Frenchman. He was obliged to leave France to not be killed by the Catholics.
And what religion is your family today? You said one side was Baptist and one side was Methodist.
They were all evangelics.
And still today,
they had no Catholics mixed up, but today it's already mixed up. As many are Catholics.
Within your family.
Yeah.
And before coming here, I went to Belém and talked to some of the descendants of the Santarém colony there, and they haven't maintained an interest in their story. There are very few people that maintain contact with the U.S. or
Many has interest and have contact, but many my children, for an example, they don't care any way or another. So it's opening up all the time, more and more. Like me, Kito, for example, he has a wish to know about our ancestors, but many of the ancestors today don't care and don't give much importance to it.
And what do you know about the situation in the South today? Are you
Really, I don't know today.
Do you know how different it is from the way it was before the Civil War?
I believe it's all different nowadays. In the States, has many people that still want to know. I received a telephone call from Alabama, here at home, through Kito. He had informed an American called me up from Alabama. I spoke half an hour with him. His name, I remember, was Você lembra o nome daquele cara, o Kito, o Mask? Because I believe, because Americans made an interview with me in the cemetery of America. And I ended up in the internet. And he through the internet is what he called me.
Are there any other stories that you have about your family that you, the development of the beginnings of the colony here, their role in that?
I didn't understand very well.
Do you have any other stories about the beginning of the colonies, about what kind of houses they lived in, and how they started the colony?
Well, what I know about that is part of the colony that came to Brazil. They went into this region here of Campinas. Some went to other states of Brazil. My ancestors came to the littoral of São Paulo here, Iguape, where he went. They lived 3 or 4 years in Iguape, in that zone around there in Iguape. But they finally went back to Santa Barbara, where most of the Americans concentrated. Many concentrated here, beyond Campinas.
And what kind of houses do they build there to live in?
They built ones that some built good, some I'll say their houses was made of timber and mud. But others that they gained very well and built good houses, same style of I'll show you here in the book. I believe I've got it here. Give me this book here. This book was written by a cousin of mine, a descendant.
I found this book on my library's webpage this morning because I wanted to read it when I go back to school, and we have it at my university, a copy of it.
Here, I believe it has pictures. Here my uncle's house. He built his house there.
Whose house is this? This is your. Whose house is this?
It was William Ferguson's house. Let's see. Yeah, it was this house. Here has got many stories of the Masons. This is my cousin that wrote this book. Here's the tombstones of the cemetery. Let's see if I can. Here's the names of all the American families that came to Brazil. Yeah, my grandfather. My aunt. This is the obelisk of the cemetery. This is a view of the cemetery from far. Here. It's called agricultura. Não sei o que era, o Kito. Aqui penso que cada vez, aqui iniciou aqui. Americans had started. Many institutions today was implanted by the Americans.
With the agriculture, they brought seeds
Well,
for
the agriculture was the Americans what implanted the, let's say the modern agriculture in Brazil. Because as the Brazilians, they didn't even know what was a plow, to plow the ground. They worked with hoes in those days. The Americans brought the plow to Brazil.
And they introduced which new crops? The melons.
Pardon?
They introduced new crops to the land as well. The melons and what else?
Melons. It was the Americans that brought the melons to Brazil. Before them, no, I don't know nobody planted melons. They imported the seed and began planting melons. It was as I say, the Americans implanted the modern agriculture in Brazil. Right? The way I see it.
And you said now the families are spreading out more, and they're marrying with Brazilians. So, what do you think caused this change, this decision to start marrying outside of the community, just as it grew larger? Or?
What I have to answer to that is that the Americans, some went one place to live, others went to another, and they opened up. And the children that were born grew up among the Brazilians. They didn't grow up among the Americans. And they began marrying Brazilians instead of among the Americans. Some married, but many began marrying Brazilian ladies. Good.
Anything else, or?
Spoke English. That's the reason I learned how to speak English. So as my cousin says in the book, we grew up, the second generation grew up bilingual, speaking two languages. I began speaking Portuguese when I went to school, 7, 8 years old. Mixing up with other Brazilians is when I began speaking Portuguese, because at home we only spoke English. My mother, that was born in Brazil, she spoke English, Portuguese very badly. She only spoke English. And that's more or less a story of how I grew up. These pictures you see, we were little tots, say in English, little tots, barefooted, didn't have my father didn't have enough money to buy shoes for us. You can see them in the picture. Myself in our tour, my brother, we'll go barefooted. Our little clothes that mother made for us. And that's the way we grew up. And who taught me how to read and write? Mother, my mother. I remember very well, every night after dinner, she would clean the table and we would sit around the table for her to teach us how to spell. She began with the ABC to spell. Say the words D-O-D, D-O-G, dog. We had to spell and say the word. That's the way my mother taught us how to speak and write English.